It's time to keep moving in this series on the Hall of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11. We've now done 2 videos to essentially set up what we're going to do is we're going to walk through every one of these mentions. Might be a few verses, might be one verse at a time, but every time the Hall of Faith mentions a new character in this Hall of Faith, I want to take a look at why they're in there. But in order to do that, we spent the first 2 videos trying to reframe and have a more appropriate understanding of what the Hall of Faith even is. I love the term. The term is clever. It's been very helpful to me since my earliest days of Sunday school and then Bible college. I don't have a problem calling it the Hall of Faith. The tricky part is that when we think in our culture of a Hall of Fame, that's the play on words there. We think of a baseball Hall of Fame or a football Hall of Fame. It is those famous players that were the best of the best. Like they were the best at the game. They were the best at what they did. And so when you think of Hall of Faith in the same way that you think of Hall of Fame, I think our knee-jerk reaction is to assume that these were the great heroes of faith, that they did faith better than everyone else. And it's not even that that's going to end up being totally wrong, but it's certainly not totally right if we're kind of making those Western assumptions about what it means to be the greatest of the greatest of the greatest. And so we wanted to step back and see what the author of Hebrews is doing to set up this chapter, to set up the Hall of Faith, what's leading into that. And so we stepped back quite a ways, about halfway through chapter 10, and we heard the author saying, we cannot give up. We have to persevere. We know what suffering is. The author says, I have watched you suffer, and I have watched you stand by others who are suffering. And so you know what it means to suffer. You know what it means to encourage other people to make it through suffering. And now you can't give up either. You have to keep going just like you've helped other people keep going. And then that last part of the chapter we looked at in the last video, the author seems to call back to Habakkuk. That in the midst of this, we can't be people that shrink back. We have to be people that persevere. That perseverance pep talk, as we looked at in video 1. Like we have to be people that persevere. And they call back, the author calls back to Habakkuk to say, you know, there was another time like Habakkuk where God was doing something. There was another time in Habakkuk's day where God's people were suffering. And God's people had to persevere. And the reason they had to persevere and the reason it was so difficult is because they could have never understood what God was doing, even if God wanted to tell them. And so the righteous will live by their faithfulness. When you give yourself to faithfulness, especially in the midst of suffering, especially when you're persevering and showing spiritual resiliency, that will find life, Habakkuk said. The Jewish conversation heard Habakkuk say, life comes out of those who live in faithfulness. The righteous will live. They will find life by their faithfulness. And so the writer of Hebrews seems to talk about that. And then at the end of that second video, we did look at the very first reference of by faith. But in this case, it wasn't even a character. There wasn't even a person. It was by faith creation was made. Creation was created by faith. So the first mention of the Hall of Faith isn't even a person. And we talked about how this only makes sense because they just got done saying we have to persevere, we have to make it through suffering, because God, Habakkuk, God has to be up to something that we couldn't see, we couldn't understand, even if he told us. So trust that God's up to something that we could never perceive. Which is why the first verse of chapter 11, no chapter break, the very next verse says, faith is being confident of the things we hope for, to being certain of the things we don't see. We assume that God, like the things that we can't see, are so much bigger and so much better than the things that we can see. And the first instance, the first example the author chooses to pull out is creation. Creation, all of creation, all the beauty, all the wonder, all the majesty of creation was made out of nothing. All of creation was made out of what was everything that's visible. Like, think of the greatest things you can think of in creation. As I make this video, this was a long time ago by the time this video posts, but as I make this video, it was just a couple weeks ago, everybody was taking photographs of the northern lights at night. Think of like your favorite landscapes. Think of sitting on the beach. Think of your favorite mountain backdrop. Think of just the favorite places you've been. The things that are visible. The writer of Hebrews says, well, everything that's visible was made out of invisible. So all the goodness, all the wonder, all the majesty, all the amazing was made out of nothing. Assume that kind of creative power. Faith is being confident of things we can't see. Assume that the kind of creative power that could make everything in creation out of nothing, assume that that's behind it all. Assume that there's so much that can be done that we could never see or even begin to understand. If we're right about this reading of Hebrews 11, we'll have to see if it carries through to the next example. The next example we'll look at today is going to be Abel, in the book of Genesis. Cain and Abel, the first two brothers, the first two sons, these brothers that were born to Adam and Eve. I find it interesting that Adam and Eve don't make the list. The very first person to make the list is Abel. After creation, we go to Abel. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith, Abel still speaks, though he is dead. Kind of three things. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering. By faith, he was commended for his righteousness, and by faith, he still speaks, even though he's dead. Now, I know that as we typically read this, whenever we read the words by faith, I know we always think of theological abstraction. We think of, well, Abel has faith, and so because of his faith, he does these things. Like Abel has faith. Again, he's a hero. He's in the Hall of Faith. He's a hero. He's a hero of faith. He's in the Hall of Fame of faith players. So it's by his faith that he offered an offering. And so you read that, and on an initial reading, that makes sense. On a surface level, simple reading, that I could see how, at least for two of the three, I'm not sure how the third one works in that reading. Like by faith, like Abel has faith and so he brings an offering. Okay, I could see that, maybe. By faith, Abel is commended for his righteousness. Okay, grammatically I have some questions, but I can go there. By faith, he still speaks. What does that have to do with Abel's? I know poetic we can be like, well, because of his faith, he still speaks, he lives on. Okay, that's fine. But of course, that didn't work in the last video's reference. Creation doesn't have faith, and creation wasn't made because of your faith or my faith or Abel's faith or Adam's faith. None of those faiths existed. Like, again, I think faith is being certain of what we hope for, confident of what we hope for, certain of what we don't see. Faith, for the writer of Hebrews in this instance, faith is believing that there's something, that God is bigger than the circumstances, that God is bigger than what can be seen, that God is bigger than what's in front of us. Because it didn't make sense to say by faith all creation was made. So what if we looked at this verse about Abel through that lens? Here's what I would say. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. Here's my question. Did God tell anybody to bring offerings? Like, offerings aren't specified by God until much later. Like, a system isn't really built until Leviticus. You could say that God tells Abraham in Genesis 15 to bring some, but people are offering sacrifices. And why is Abel's sacrifice better than Cain's? I don't want to get lost in that rabbinical argument, and there is a great rabbinical argument. I'm going to put a book. I'm going to link a book recommendation in the description of this podcast. It's by a Jewish rabbi, one of my favorites, Rabbi David Fohrman. He's not a follower of Jesus, but his book is just phenomenal on the book of Genesis, on Adam, Eve, and Cain and Abel. The beast that crouches at the door. I'm gonna link that book in the description. If you want to dive deep into the details here, read that book. Don't expect it in my YouTube. Read that book instead. But just generally, let's back up just a moment and say, why is Abel, like one of the first people one of the first people to offer an offering? Why are they offering an offering? They haven't been told to offer an offering as far as we're told. There's no law. There's no Torah. That was a fun little ditty. Let's turn that off, shall we? There's no Torah, there's no law, there's no sacrificial system. Why is he offering an offering? By faith, Abel is confident of things that he hopes for. By faith, Abel is certain of things he doesn't see. So Abel has belief that there's something. He's making an offering, and he doesn't even know what offering to make. He doesn't even have instructions to follow. But he believes that there's something. Again, he's one of the first human beings, as the story tells it. He believes there's something out there, something more, something he can't see that's related to the things that he can see. And so he offers an offering by faith. By faith he was commended. How did it read? By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. So Abel does this thing that's not even instructed of him, but it must come from his heart. It comes from his will. It comes from this hunch. It comes from, I don't know what you want to call it, but he believes there's something more going on, and God says, I love that. God commends him. God speaks well of him because of his righteousness. He says, yes, you are aware, Abel. You're aware that it's not just about the things that you see. It's not just about your material world. It's not just about you. It's not just about your circumstances and your story. You have this awareness, Abel, that it's bigger than you. It's bigger than your story. It's bigger than your material reality. There's something more. And God says, aha, it's faith. God speaks well. God commends him. Because by faith, Abel's confident of things that he can't see. He's confident of things that he hopes for. He's certain. Abel has some level of certainty about things that he couldn't even see. He can't see them. They're not material. But he thinks there's more going on. What was the last thing? This one is where it really makes sense for me. By faith, Abel still speaks, even though he's dead. In the Jewish mind, and the mind of, this book is written to Hebrews, that's why it's called Hebrews. In the mind of the Jewish audience, and in the mind of the Jewish author who wrote this, Abel ends up being the representative of injustice. Like, the Jewish conversation would often talk about, in the Second Temple period, the blood of Abel. The blood of Abel. The blood of Abel. That cries out from the ground. Abel was the one who represented people who suffer for doing the right thing. Abel did something right. We just read about it. He offered an offering and was commended in his righteousness. Abel did the right thing and ended up getting killed by his brother. Abel lived by faith and suffered for it. Hey, wait a minute. What is this whole Hebrews thing about? The writer said you have to persevere. You have to hang in there. You can't give up. You've got to be resilient. You got to hang in there because you know what it is to suffer. Because you've helped I've watched you, the author says, I've watched you stand by those who are suffering. You know what suffering is. And what's one of the first examples that the writer gives in the story of God? Abel. Abel's been here before. In fact, Abel even died for believing in the story. Abel believed. Abel had faithfulness. And he died for it. And now we are all caught up in a story, believing that somehow, somewhere, there's something going on where vindication is at hand. The writer of Hebrews is going to hint, I'm going to hint at it now. The writer of Hebrews is going to say this later. Like, we have to persevere on some level. We have to persevere on Abel's behalf. We have to believe that on some level, faithfulness will be somehow, somewhere, someday, faithfulness will be vindicated. Because what happened to Abel isn't right. The blood of Abel still speaks to us today. And so the writer says you have to persevere. You have to keep going. You see, I think one of the lessons here in Hebrews 11 is not that it's the hall of faith, not that it's the group of people who did the best faith the best. It's not the all-stars of faithing in Hebrews 11. It's telling the story of God to remind us that God has been up to something throughout history, and you and I are a part of this thing that has always been so much bigger, so much better, so much more expansive, so much more transcendent than just our material, physical circumstances and the world that you and I experience. Suffering is not just about my here and now today. It is very much about that. My goodness, anybody that's tasted of suffering knows that to be true. But the writer of Hebrews is saying, don't lose sight of the fact that our physical material suffering is also a part of a much more larger cosmic, even beyond cosmic, a much larger, that's faith. Faith is believing that God is doing something in this story. And my resiliency, my perseverance, my faithfulness, it's not about me earning something. It's not a transaction. It's about me getting swept up in this thing that's been happening since the opening pages of creation. Believe, the writer of Hebrews says, that something bigger, something invisible is happening beyond the visible. Live in faith. Don't shrink. We cannot belong to those who shrink back. We have to lean in, because it's by faith that the movement of God, that the story of God and the story of all creation has moved forward. Be swept up, be captivated, be compelled by, be inspired by that, the writer of Hebrews says. But we're just getting started, aren't we? I mean, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, we got 10, 15 more characters. Probably more than that now that I'm looking. We got all kinds of people to talk about. So we're just getting started. I think the next one that might be up is Enoch. I look forward to talking about him next.